Welcome, folks. You are listening to Race Matters, and I am the host, Eddie Carson. And as we look to do every episode, we look to delve into the nomenclatures as we explore the realities of race, class, gender, culture, society aspects as we really ponder what are the things that we need to delve into, learn, and grow when we're talking about the expanded nature of being a learned community. And that means listening, engaging in dialogues and conversations that sometimes I self espouse, other ways in which I bring wonderful, excellent guests to the fold here. And that happens as we are here at Chopper Radio 96.3. And I'm glad to have you here. You can find Race Matters on SoundCloud as well as YouTube. My guest this week, and I'm excited. Oh, I'm super excited to have Yann Kumin here. Yann is he's a brilliant, brilliant, brilliant brother. He has a great story. I've had him on my campus speaking. I first came across Yann at a conference and listening to him speak and engage, and I said, "This is the kind of person that you want to put in front of people." A, he's brilliant. B, he can deliver a message. C, it comes from a place and a sense of authenticity for the fact that this is the kind of genuine person you want to have a relationship with no matter what. Oh, so Jan currently is the Equity and Inclusion Program Manager for the upper and middle school at Milton Academy. Milton Academy is in Milton, Massachusetts, just in case folks want to know and all this stuff. But Jan, and not to delve too much into this bio here, and some of this will come out in our conversation. Jan is a product of boarding school, of prep schools, being a stud academic elite student and athlete as well over a period of time. We could say that. Having gone off and even engaged in college, doing that good academic and athletic stuff too, and then having a coaching career, teaching career, public speaking, mentoring, and all of those things, right? That kind of defines my friend here. Jan, welcome to the fold of Race Matters. How we doing?
I'm doing well, brother. Thank you, man. I'm so excited to be here. It's an honor. I've been a fan of the pod for a minute, so it's wild to be here with you and everybody who's going to be tuning in.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and give a shout out to my wife because what I do is I draft this list of folks I draft that I want to invite to the show, folks that I know personally, like you, folks that I don't know as personally, who I voted or brought into the fold too. And she was like, "Oh, you know who would be really, really great on this show?" And we started talking about you,
Oh
and
man.
it was good. One of the things that I want to start off by asking you a question. Have you followed the situation of that sixth grade teacher, Sarah something in Ada, Idaho, the one who put up the sign, "All are welcome," with a different hands, different background, racial backgrounds to show that this is a learned place where I love you and I want to accept you. Have you followed that story?
Yeah. I probably haven't followed it as deeply as I should, but it definitely like came across my feed and I read into it a little bit for sure. I think like it's in a way it's sad to say that the measure of bravery that it takes in today's America to express something that in all honesty should be so basic from an educational platform, right, and from a creation of an educational space, right. To me, the notion that all people are welcome, that all people have the ability to come into an educational space and be affirmed, right, in their identity so that they can learn and so that they can grow and so that they can come to better understand themselves and the world around them is a no-brainer, right? And it's to me a little bit surreal that it's national news and controversial in any sense that a teacher
Absolutely.
is delivering that message to their students and to their school community. So I think it's a signal of the times in which we live right now.
I sit there and I think about that story, and folks can think and talk about all the ways in which we're seeing the collapse of society, civil society. But I think that becomes an endemic matter especially when you're telling a sixth grade teacher that she cannot teach her kids to love other people. This is about love and respect and dignity, all of those things. And I will say this, I was proud of the high school students who marched down to the, I guess, the superintendent office building and protested on behalf of this teacher. I mean, which is great. I mean, I hate to say this, that superintendent office is not going to listen to them because this brave sister's out of a job at the end of the
Yep.
year because of her defiance to love and to teach what love means. I go back and I think we all like Mr. Keating in Dead Poet Society. Mr. Keating was wonderful. He was awesome. He stood for his values and wanted to teach those 1950 students whatever it was he was teaching. But in the end, he got the axe. Had
Hmm.
to go. Can't-
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's like I've been thinking a lot about like what our current state of affairs means to like broader understandings of identity, right? And thinking a lot about conceptions of dominant identity, white identity, cis identity, male identity in America, and find a disheartening common thread in the notion that so much of that identity, from at least like a national placement perspective, is rooted in the absence of empathy, right? Is rooted in the absence of love, is rooted in the absence of compassion, and it's antithetically defined. It's defined in the negative so much, right? This notion of I am who I am because I am not this thing, this other person, right? And what it means to our national sense of self, such as it is, that so much of our individual identities in regards to the dominant are defined that way, right? So much defined by what I am not, as opposed to what I am. And in terms of like thinking about how it is that we walk out of that, is a longer and broader topic, right? Because I think that that has been a center point of American social dominance for so long, and one of the structures of manipulations of class warfare, right? As we all know, right? This notion, it's like I may be poor, but at least I'm not black. I may be poor, but at least I'm not gay. I may be poor, but at least I'm not trans. I'm holding on to this one thing that I have. And as that starts to dissipate, and as the value of that in a broader society starts to dissipate, what is the reaction of people who hold tightly to that? And there's a weird logic there, right? That we can get into down the line a little bit. But that's a lot of what comes to mind when I read this story in Idaho and stories like it.
Well, it's interesting. We talk about that story there, and I want to take a second because, I want to bring it back to you. And one of the reasons why I'm a big fan of yours is for the fact that I believe that you offer the type of leadership and presence that so many folks need to see, so many young people need to see. It's why I talk about you all the time. That's why I had you on my campus. It's why I wanted folks to get to know you. It's why when I'm in spaces, I always tell folks, "Hey, do you know this brother? Oh, you right over there?" And I'm not trying to embarrass you, my friend, because I think your story is one that's fascinating. The fact that being attending a prep school in Massachusetts at Northfield Mount Herman, right? And then going off to college at, I don't want to, that school down in
That
Cambridge.
school in Cambridge,
That
yeah. No,
school in
well,
Cambridge, right? I mean, I'll go ahead and say, it's Harvard, but
Harvard.
it's Harvard. The running joke is, how do you know if someone went to Harvard? They're
They'll
going to
tell
tell
you.
you they went to Harvard. You won't get
uh,
to that conversation. But so when you, and if you would share with our listeners a bit about your identity and who you are, and then about your perspective, because I don't want to speak for you. I think that would be wonderful for folks to hear.
for sure. I'm a I'm a study in dissonance. I say that all the time. I am a man of mixed race. My father is black. My mom is white. Um, and my mom's family is probably Ukrainian Jew, maybe Lithuanian Jew, maybe Russian Jew. We're not entirely sure. My dad's family comes from East Africa. And so, there's a study of dissonance just in that.
Mhm.
So I say all the time, I identify both as a black man and as a white man. I identify as a man of mixed race entirely. I'm genetically, phenotypically super light, which is weird, but also, has created I don't know if confusion is probably a decent word, but a sense of not really falling into the American binary, right? From like a very young age, right? It's a real common um, expression of mixed race peoples, right? It's just kind of too light for the brothers, a little too spicy for the white folk, and so you're in this limbo. You sort of exist in this ether that floats between, and so manners of expression or how it is that I dress or who I'm sitting with or riding with in a car oftentimes is like determinant of how I'm perceived outwardly. And from a racial identity perspective, I've gotten everything under the sun. I've had folk who I peg me as a black man out the gate. I've had folks who think I am an entirely white. I've had lots of people come up to me and speak Spanish. I don't speak a word of Spanish. I've gotten Greek, I've gotten Egyptian, I've gotten indigenous. It's wild. Um, I'm also a gay man. So I'm a cis gay man. I came out late in life, which I'm sure we'll get to and talk a little bit about why. Um, and so that obviously is a big part of my identity. I think how it is that people love is important, right, to who they are as human beings. I'm a very big believer that love is our universal language. I'm not sure what sits above us in the ether and governs the force of the universe. But I'm pretty sure that the center point of that are conceptions like love and compassion and mercy. So, when people uh, talk about why my sexual orientation or my sexual identity is important, my answer is always because who you love and how you love matters to who you are as a human being. Um, I was really blessed to have a just a force of a mom. She's an incredible human. She worked for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees for um, 39 years, I think, in total, living all over the world. And most of my life was spent being raised by my mom. I'm my mom's only child. And then on my dad's side, I have three siblings, two older brothers, one younger sister, but we all have different moms. So it's a very like loose family structure, not a ton of relationship there. So I think like in terms of who I am as a person or became as a person, my mom was extraordinarily formative in that. We lived all over the place. We lived in Thailand, we lived in Belgium, we lived in Switzerland, we lived in the former Yugoslavia during the breakup of the
Wow.
Yugoslav
Right.
Republic. And then home was also kind of back in Boston at the same time. So there was a lot of like flopping back and forth between worlds, between cultural understandings, between, you know, the things that govern basic importance for a society are hugely different depending on where it is that you go, right? And so I learned very early that the world is a big place and that America is but a place in it.
Oh,
Um,
that's nice. That's
you
nice.
know, and that conception was huge for me, and I think allowed me in a lot of ways to uh, get out of the trap. I talk about the trap of American identity is the notion that American identity is central not only to you as an American, but to everybody else. And that's just
No.
false. Like I don't have any other way to say it other than the fact that it's not true. right? And it also plays into these notions of American superiority, right? The notion that like our systems are so much better than every other system out there. As somebody who has gone to see a doctor in Belgium, I can tell you that that's just not true, right? Like as somebody who's gone to see a doctor just north in Canada, right? When my mom was working there, like not true. I'm not even a citizen of that country. I walked right in, saw a doctor, got the meds I needed to see, and paid $0 for that. Like,
Ooh.
so like the notion that it's not possible is a uniquely American notion. That was shattered for me early, very, very, very early. My mom's work also exposed me to like the what it is that human beings are capable of doing to each other in the names of identity. I was like 8, 9 when we moved to Belgrade, and being being in oh, my default microphone just changed. I'm sorry. I think
You're
it's still
good.
working.
Yeah, we're
All
still working. We're good.
right. I think like being there during that time as a young kid, you know, in like third or fourth grade was an eye opening experience in terms of what human beings are capable of doing to each other, and what the motivations are behind those actions. Like I didn't fully understand what was sitting at the root of the Bosnian genocide. I wasn't fully comprehensive of what was sitting at the root of the collapse of the Yugoslav state. But what I did know was that people were killing other people because they weren't the same, quote unquote. Right. I did know that people were displacing other people by the hundreds of thousands, right, because they were not the same. And so these were like my formative understandings of identity. So when I came back to the States for the most part for high school, which in a lot of ways is like really where I began to fully learn about my blackness in relationship to America, that understanding was framed by those lenses, right? It was my existence as a black man in this country, right, or my existence as a man of mixed race in this country, was framed with the understanding already of what it is that people are capable of doing to others that they believe to be not like them, and why they may choose to do that. So the American myth of freedom and democracy and liberty and justice for all and access, and you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps and become anybody, never never resonated, right? As I learned about my blackness and what it meant to America as well. And then I was fortunate to have like two really incredible role models at NMH, and we can talk about that environment as well. In Ralph Bledsoe and Eric Jones. Um, Eric was probably 30 at the time that I was there. Ralph was probably a brother from Oakland originally in his like mid 40s. Um, and they sparked my conception and understanding of militancy, the necessity of radical action,
Mhm.
radical love, radical equity, and I started to kind of grip through them and through learning, right, and then through experience what it was to be black in America.
So,
Uh,
and that leads me to this one point. You just said something that's interesting because you're right. You make it back. You're in the States. Your world, your lens is big, right? It is so big. You, in and of yourself, as you've already described, as you're a diverse individual with a global view and a global lens of things. And so now you come back, you go to this prominent school, Northfield Mount Hermon, right? A predominantly white institution. I mean, overwhelmingly, right, as prominent as Northfield Mount Hermon is, it is overwhelmingly a white institution, making Black people students of color in the minority. But you're at a position where, and I'm curious, where you could go a couple different ways, right? You have those mentors, those folks who were there when you were there. But was there ever a thought where you thought, it's easier if I just try to lean towards my white identity than say my Black identity, just to fit in and not have to explain who I am?
yeah, I think like for me, the notion of
I passed as a straight man for 20 years, right? 17 years. So the notion of passing for convenience or for ease is not foreign, right, to me. I definitely think I don't know if I would say that it was a conscious
Hmm.
thought, right, when I was like 16. Um, but I think that racially, and this speaks a little bit to like what these structures are within our society. Racially, it wasn't something that I could see doing, right? It was almost as though I could grip the notion that to disavow half of myself, to disavow my blackness in America would be somehow like murderous to my own sense of self and to my own identity, right? And I never I never leapt at that. If anything, I went hard in the other direction. Um,
Interesting. Okay.
whereas for my sexual self, it wasn't even a question, right? I was straight passing, whatever that means. I was a football player. All of those things created this vehicle for me to deny the authenticity of my sexual self, and I leapt at that.
Mhm.
And then not only did I leap at it, I built around it, right? I built a whole life around it. And I did that in a racial sense at times as well. I think like later a little bit in my early adulthood. When I came back to Boston and I fell in with a lot of folks who were kind of gripping to dominant white identities, my circle for a brief moment, a few years kind of narrowed. Um, it was as though like my childhood was this explosion of access to identity. And then my young adulthood was a rebellious kind of sucking back in to create insular protections.
Was
Um,
at that point, was that in college, after college?
that was after college.
That was
I
after
would say,
college. So, let's so so your space, your circle, right? It gets smaller, right? So you go from being this young person, right, globe trotting, doing all of this stuff, and yet now as a professional out of school, the world gets it's just not as broad or expansive. Why do you think that was the case? I'm curious.
Yeah, I think like, and I want to be clear that I speak for me, and not for everyone. I think that for me, American convention, right? Senses of American convention were terrifically strong.
Mm.
For me, I say first off, like I'm a child of the '80s, right? So I'm a child of Reaganomics and Thundercats, like the '80s into the '90s. Born in '82, and like even though I was overseas, and connected with the communities that, the local communities, we were also members of the expat community, right? And so, and there were also conceptions of America that existed in a lot of those spaces that centered America as this kind of like collective cool, as this kind of like aspirational cultural identity, right? So there was like that piece of it from a geocultural sense that like infected is probably the best word to use, and like got into my brain wrap in terms of like identity and what it meant to be cool or whole or accepted or whatever else. Um, on top of that was a deep, like, talk a lot about this in therapy, right? Like, was a deep desire for a conventional family sense, and a conventional community sense. I moved every 2 or 3 years, right? So like every couple of years, I'd have to redevelop my social networks. I'd have to replace myself in a new society. I'd have to make new friends. I'd have to, you know, ingratiate myself with a new population. And I became, as a youngster, very adept at kind of recognizing what it was that people wanted to see from me and spitting that back to them. Right. And it made me a very chameleon person. So like very environmentally determinate. It depended on where I was and who I was with. And that would really govern how it was that I outwardly presented. And one of the things that I really wanted, because I didn't have it, was this like stable family and like a brother and two sisters and a dad, and we all live in the same house, and we go to Little League together, and blah blah blah, like all of this stuff. And I never had that, right? So I as soon as I got agency in any way, shape, or form as a young adult, I immediately sort of strove to create that for myself.
I got you.
And one way that I did that was by creating, like, ingratiating myself into this like tight knit community of people who had grown up together, who had like gone through grammar school and middle school together, and you know, and that was in Somerville, like after college, and after New Orleans. You know, and I threw myself into that, and I immediately just sank roots as deep as I could into that earth to hold on for dear life, right? And now I would say it was because, in large part, I had both no idea who I was and some idea of who I was, and those two, and then probably an idea of who I thought I wanted to be, and none of those things were matching. None of those things were syncing up. None of those things were lining up. And that was, I think I would say now, scary, right? And so my response to that was to grip down into this place and to derive senses of love and senses of community and senses of brotherhood, and as well senses of power and social power from places like Somerville, from places like football, right? That fed me notions of worth, fed me notions of community, fed me notions of agency, all of which were colored by American dominance, right? It's warm in there, right? And I equate it to pine glades. It's like these trees that bend over and shield you from all of the things that are actually happening in the world, and you can just sit there and everything is all right, and nobody's really asking what's going on at the center of that pine glade. That's what it means. At least that's what it meant for me, to live in the dominant. It was quiet. It wasn't scary. And
You know,
that can draw you, you know?
no, and that's fascinating. And yet, when I hear you, and as I'm listening, as I hear you, right, I think back to these aspects, these elements when we talk about the sense of you. You know, for folks who don't know you, right? You're an athletic person. You're a masculine person, right? You're a person that, you know, you walk down the street, you're like, oh, that's a dude's dude right there. I mean, that brother, that's what that brother is. And yet all the things, and through all of your beautiful, amazing work, you focus your time not only, you know, deconstructing and helping folks appreciate thinking about racial identity and what does it mean, really doing a great job as you've done on my campus and for my students, really talking about the problems and the sins of toxic masculinity and what does that look like. And that brings us back to you as a gay man. And as a gay man, right, this sense that you hit that not from yourself, but from so many folks for a long period of time. Help folks understand that narrative, because it is part of that intersectionality that makes you such a amazing human being, my friend.
I appreciate that. I think, like, I see a lot of like, I'm gonna try to find the best way to put this. I see a lot of like my dissonance as an obligation, right? Like the aspects of myself that present in connection to conventional dominance, right? Like masculinity being one of them. People equate conceptions of masculinity with sexual orientation. One of the defining characteristics of American masculinity is heteronormativity, right? I am to a point, am a living, walking, and breathing example of the fact that those two things are not connected at all. They're actually separate. And so one of the things that I relish in doing is interacting with populations who decide that they like me for traditionally masculine characteristics, before learning that I'm gay, then learning that I'm gay and having to reconcile the homophobia that often comes from those traditionally masculine spaces, and to be like, well, what do I do now? Because I've already decided that I like this guy and that he espouses quote unquote values that I respect. But there's this thing, and his queerness is troubling to me for whatever reason. So I see my dissonance as like an obligation at this point too, right? And it's kind of like my purpose. My purpose is to be a human being who crosses a lot of those spaces that are very clearly demarcated in American society. I think in terms of like understanding my journey to that point, I was terrified when I first started to understand myself as gay. Mm-hmm. I remember that fear like viscerally. I could put myself back in it very, very quickly, in part because it's still pretty scary to be gay in America. So it's not a large leap, right? To remember what it felt like when I was like 17 or 18 years old and realizing, that I didn't love in this way that I had been taught was the way to love. And it was a very different era for representation of LGBTQ plus people in the world around us and in the media. We're moving in a very different direction in that sense to a point, but I didn't have a ton of gay role models in my life. Teachers or definitely not coaches. I was existing in spaces where the F slur was thrown around pretty regularly, as were other, connections to gayness that were framed as pejorative. Gayness was framed to me as weakness. It was framed to me as disgusting. It was framed to me as like, in a lot of these spaces, the worst possible thing that you could be. And that transcended race, right? The Black community has a long way to go in terms of how it is that it approaches queer identity within the Black community. That intersectionality is very present. So all of those things were screaming at me that what I was starting to understand about myself was going to consign me to misery, was going to govern the entirety of my life, and was shameful. So the first stage of my journey with that was aggressive denial, right? Like, nope, not me, right? I buried it. I buried it as hard as I possibly could. And my ability to bury it over the next like 4 or 5 years would just kind of progressively weaken, right? Because we're creatures of biological need, right? Like, and our need for love and our need for sex and our need for connection are different for all of us. Like, not to say that everybody out there needs sex, because there are plenty of people who don't. But for me, it was a need that like I couldn't just turn off. And I kept like, trying to turn it off, but it just kept turning back on. And then I would turn it off again and it just turned back on. And as I explored gay community, mostly through the internet, then I shifted from full on denial to compartmentalization, right? I can maintain 2 separate worlds. And as I'm doing this, I'm teaching and I'm starting my coaching career. My coaching career is reaffirming to me all of these things that I've been taught about masculinity in America, masculinity in sport, and what queerness and homosexuality is to those spaces, right? I mean, so being out to me wasn't conceptually possible. I tell people sometimes that like I coached for a program where we had like in our coach's office, we had like a list of rules, right? There were like coach's rules, like things like, flush the toilet after you use it, or like, don't bring onion bagels into the office, or no fish in the microwave, But like rule number 1 on that whiteboard was don't get gay. That, and it was a joke, right? It was funny, supposedly. But but I'm seeing that. And then not only am I internalizing it, right, but I have to now be conscious of my reaction to it. Because if I have a problem with it, then all of these people that I'm here with are going to be like, oh, there might be something funny about Q, right? And so now I'm not only internalizing it, I'm internalizing it, and then I'm moderating myself, I'm regulating myself, and then I'm presenting something outwardly that is in fact tearing my own humanity down, right? I'm ripping my own self in order to gain what? To gain affirmation or to gain acceptance or to gain or just to live unquestioned. And football became a huge part of both the compartmentalization and my beard, right? Because nobody would suspect that this human being was gay. If he was gay, why would he be involved in football? It's like the worst place to be gay. Like it's not.
Although I think basketball is making a nice
Yeah,
run for it.
yeah, it's in that mix too, right? So then like there was this era of compartmentalization, right? And during that period, I was like actively dating women. Simultaneously, I like met my ex who lived at the time in Nebraska and then eventually in Wisconsin, and we started like a long distance relationship. And all of a sudden, I was like two people, but not two people, right? It's just, like a human with two faces, right? And there were elements of those faces that crossed over and that were the same because I am who I am as a human being, right? But it was this positioning of two separate lives. And that went on for 7 or 8 years. I did a lot of damage to myself. I did a lot of damage to other people. One of the hardest things to reconcile about my journey, is that like I engaged in relationships with people, serious relationships with people. I gave people a vision of a future, right? I fed visions of their future that were not rooted in truth and that were not rooted in authenticity. And that is damage. And there are some people in my life who have forgiven me for that damage, and there are some people who haven't. And sometimes the only thing that we can do is acknowledge that we did something that was wrong and that caused harm. But we're not going to get forgiveness for that. And possibly we don't necessarily deserve it. I don't think that these are people who hate me as a result of my decisions, but I did things to their senses of trust, right? I did things to their senses of self. I did things to their senses of self-worth because they weren't afforded full explanations, right? I would just be engaged in a relationship and then I would just leave, right? Because it became untenable for me. But I would just throw some platitude out there like, oh, it's not you, it's me, or it's just not working, or I need to focus on my career or football or whatever it was. And it was trash. It was, maybe partially true, but certainly not wholly true, right? And so that there was just this period of mounting damage, right? That led to the next stage, which was wholly insular. I turned inward. I put up walls. I went to football. I went to work, and then I went home. And the walls got thicker and thicker, and the noise reverberating out of my spirit and self against the walls of this cave were just a cacophony bouncing off, of myself. And that drove me to suicidal ideation, and that was the darkest of times, probably around 2017, 2018.
And what's crazy about that is that sense of confidence that I get from you when I hear you speak, when I hear you tell your story. I mean, 2017 was like just yesterday.
Yeah.
That's mind-boggling to think about, right? I mean, and that just illustrates your own growth and your own sense of self and purpose, right? I mean, I don't need to tell you this. You know yourself and this better than I do. I'm just learning from you, my friend.
Yeah, man. It's wild when I think about how not long ago all of that was, right? We're looking at 7 years, 8 years, it feels like a lifetime ago.
Yeah.
But it really wasn't. And I think like a lot of times when I speak, especially to like, I just did some work with some of the Milton athletic teams too, and talked a little bit about this conception is things that seem innocuous. You don't realize the power that they have to somebody who is struggling against the waterfall of messaging that they're receiving that connects directly to who they are as a person. And that once you turn on the kind of spigot of self-hate, it's very, very difficult to turn it off. It's certainly very, very difficult to turn it off for yourself. I, in a way, was lucky to get cancer in 2019 because it put to the test my desire to die. And I had to answer a direct question to the universe itself about whether or not I wanted an opportunity to continue to breathe. I had to make a decision as to whether or not I was going to fight. And one of my reasons for fighting was I wanted an opportunity to live a whole life. It took me 17 years to climb out of the depths of self-hate that I had created for myself. And some of that is on me. Mm-hmm. And some of that is on the world around me. And some of that is on people.
That people part. And I appreciate you saying that because, you know, I get it. And I get that sense of I'm going to put the onus on me, but I do believe the onus falls on other folks. And, you know, and that brings me, you know, back to a point you noted earlier, this idea that, you know, you're speaking to a lot of the athletic teams on your campus, for example. You spoke to some of the athletic teams here. You've spoken at conferences and other places to athletic programs. It must be reassuring particularly to our male athletes to have you, those particularly on your campus, share your story, your identity, be who you are, and they know who you are. And it's like, oh, that brother, yeah, he's great. Oh, he's gay. He's great. I mean, that's how we really push back on the problem of individuals and people. Or tell me, no, brother Eddie, I think you're just being a little too optimistic. Help me understand this, my friend.
I think both are true. Yeah. I think that on the one side, representation matters, right?
No.
Like I'm a really, really big believer in this. Like if I had seen a gay football coach in 1998, what would that have done to my sense of self, right? What would that have done to my understanding of what is possible? Representation is about opening the doors to future possibility, right? Seeing somebody who holds your identity doing something, doesn't really matter what it is, as long as it's positive and open and authentic and whole and true, flings open the doors to somebody who's just starting to understand who they are, whether that's in connection to sexual identity or gender, whether it's in connection to race or culture or religion. So on the one side is, yeah, there's some really, really cool moments that I've been able to have with individual athletes and with programs. There's a sophomore at Milton who plays on the football team. Love this kid, big offensive lineman. We're starting a combating toxic masculinity community space, right, between the middle school and the upper school. And a lot of that comes from conversations that we have had about what football did to my own conception of self and my identity, right? And to hear, you know, I have a picture of my boyfriend, Eric, on my desk, the two of us at work. We did like this, you know, Christmas photo shoot a year ago. It is real cute. You know, we buy pine trees and all that stuff. And I've seen it. You know,
it's a great picture.
We're gazing lovingly into each other's eyes, you know, and like that picture sits on my desk. And this kid is there, and that picture is there, and he thinks Eric is my husband. And so like he talks regularly about like, what are you and your husband doing for vacay, or what are y'all doing for break?
No pressure on you there, or y'all.
No pressure at all, right? And It's good pressure, man. I'm really lucky to have found Eric. He's had a lot of patience with me in my journey and my growth. That's another story. But and so to hear this kid who is deeply rooted in conceptions of traditional quote unquote masculinity, both with regards to where he comes from and with regards to the sport that he plays, be able to seamlessly, it seems, right, start to understand, like, it doesn't bother him. That same sense of distaste or questioning that I often saw in people in football spaces, it's not gripping him, right? Is that universally true across the board? No, right? I would say that impact has been made in those spaces, because what you're doing when I'll speak for me, when I go out there and I put my story out there, and it includes the most vulnerable moments, right? The moments most rooted in self-hate, the moments most rooted in fear, and I put that out in front of people. That's a human being,
Yes.
right? And now there's at least the beginnings of a bridge of connection, right? Where somebody could say, like, oh man, when I use the F slur in the locker room, like, that's what comes from that, right? Like, and is that something that I want on my own head, right? Do I want in 15 years to be the person that he's telling this story about, to be the teammates in the locker room who and most of us don't have a desire to harm, right? Like, it's not, that's learned, right? No 8-year-old wakes up at 8 years old and says, when I grow up, mommy, I want to be a bigot, right? Like, you learn how to do this. There's logical paths. And I truly believe that at everybody's heart is a desire to be good, and to espouse love and to treat people with respect. But when you connect your own worth and identity to the amount that you disrespect somebody, or when you connect that identity to a negative definition, right? The only way to build that identity becomes denigrating another person. So that's the break, right? If you can get them away from that. And as much as I love talking to players, the people I really love talking to and are the hardest to get to are coaches. Because as much as the identities have been built up in those kids, they're young, they're malleable, they're just starting out. When I'm talking to football coaches, I'm talking about grown human beings who have put 40 years, 30 years, 20 years, not just behind this thing, winning football games, but behind an identity, a conception of who they are that is wholly rooted in this sport, that in turn is wholly rooted in conceptions of masculinity that, whether they like it or not, are minimizing the realities and existences of other people, right? Those are the people.
You know, and you said something right there, and it just got me thinking about, think about just the years and the decades of harm. Coaches, to your point, because you're one person, you're a dynamic human being and a dynamic individual, and you can't be in a million places preaching and celebrating and informing and letting folks know. Going back to the beginning of this episode, thinking about that awesome sister up in Idaho who just wanted to display a sign saying that we love people and come in, though I think her message is being, kind of propagated quite well right now. But just the damage and the harm that folks do over time because they have to fit into this narrative, this scope that's there. My friend, as we get to the end of this, near the end of this episode, and folks, those of you who are chiming in, I'm the host, Eddie Carson, here at Race Matters on WJOP, LP Joppa Radio 96.3. You can find Race Matters on SoundCloud as well as YouTube. I am here with Yann Kumin, my guest here, who is really launching, leaning into notions of identity. But I'd say this conversation, my friend, has been much more than just this sense of identity. It is, how do we connect to our neighbor? How do we communicate? How do we respect? How do we listen? How do we love folks in a ways? Yann, one of the things that I always like to ask my guests is I like to give them the last word on every episode. And as we come to the end, it could be about whatever message, whatever theme, whatever you want to say. Just you can't sell anything on the show.
No, that's cool.
I'm going to give you the last word as we bring this episode to an end, my friend.
Man, no pressure. Yeah, I mean, I think like my last word would just be, we didn't get too much into where we are as a country right now. But my last word would be, we're at a turning point in a number of different ways. People like to think that it's a turning point that is vastly different from previous inflection points in American history. I think I would disagree.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the forces that we're seeing amplified today are nothing new in America. The forces of hate, the forces of distinction, the forces of divisiveness, the mechanisms of capitalism that are preying upon marginalized humans. These are not new things to America. But we are at a moment, I think, where we're going to have to make a decision as a society over the next 15 or 20 years, what direction our country is going to go in relation to this historical divisiveness. So in that spirit, I think like it's so corny, but I think that like my message is to reach out your hand to somebody else. There's more that unites us as humans existing in this place, whatever this existence is. There's more that unites us in our experience than pulls us apart. The machinations of divisiveness are purposeful, right? And we have to be conscious in terms of our willingness to dismantle them. That starts with being willing and able to see the humanity of another human being and to acknowledge the validity of their experience. It begins there. And I say this as somebody who's, as far to the left as Karl Marx, like that, outed myself. That begins, that's a two-way street.
Yeah.
That is a two-way street. We love to frame the rise of MAGA and populism as illogical. It is not illogical. There is logic behind it. There's a reason why people feel whole in that space. There's a reason why people feel seen in that space. And I'm not saying that the narrative is righteous, but I'm saying that we all as a people, as a species, can understand the need to feel warmth. We can understand the need to feel that we belong. We can understand the need to feel that we have agency and power, especially if we're coming from a place where that has traditionally been denied us, where it has been taken away from us in some way, shape, or form. We can understand that. And if we can come together in the spirit of validation of experience, we can start to have some conversations. So the one thing that I always tell people, and I have work to do on this too, is stop telling people that how they see their life and how their life has been lived is untrue, right? We gotta stop. We gotta stop. And that goes for MAGA, adherents who are telling, we leftist, liberal communists that what we understand about the realities of the world are untrue. And it goes to the coastal elite, right? Leftist, higher educated human being who's telling a farmer in Iowa, what it is that their life is. The reality is that we don't know, right? And if I've learned one thing in 43 years on Earth and in this journey, not to go long, it's that the things that I know are the things that are directly connected to me. What I don't know is, like, brother, like you, I know things about you, but I don't know your life. I can't know your experience. I can listen to it. I can work to understand it, and I can validate it. right? But the only way that we're going to find a common path on this journey together is if we acknowledge the realities that we're living in. Because right now, those realities are being framed as completely distant. You live in your reality, I live in my reality. So when we're actually having a conversation, what the deuce are we really talking about? Right? Because we can't even agree on whether, the pen is blue or green. Right. And so if I can say, like, well, the pen is blue to me, but that doesn't mean that it's blue to you, maybe now we can have a conversation, because then that person could say, well, actually, like, I'm looking at it and it looks green to me.
Right.
Right. And I'd be like, okay, cool. So, like, tell me, like, what that means. Like, why is it green? What do you see that tells you that it's green? Though the most productive conversations I've had with people who sit across the chasm for me are rooted in acknowledging the fact that they do feel the way that they feel, and they feel that way for a reason. And I'm not saying that to co-sign hate, right? I want to be clear that that's my line. It's the Robert Jones line. We can have a difference of opinion as long as that difference of opinion is not rooted in my right to be and my right to exist. That's my line. That does get more and more problematic as time goes on, right? Because that line is becoming more present in our day-to-day lived experience. So that's a tough, I would not ask myself nor anybody who's a marginalized person to reach across the aisle to somebody who does not see them as a human being, or does not see that they have access to human rights, or does not see that they should have access to civil rights, right? You can't put yourself in that position. But on the flip side, I would ask people who think that to really deeply consider whether they can actually look somebody in the face as a human being and say, I don't believe that you should have the right to read that book, or I don't believe that you have the right to marry the person that you love. I don't believe that you have the right to have kids, right? And if you can look at somebody in the face and you can express that to them, I guess so be it. But most people would struggle with that, because at the end of the day, I don't think that we're defined by evil as much as history would have us believe differently.
My friend, thank you so much. Folks, you just heard an outstanding conversation here. This is Race Matters. Thank you for chiming in. Thank you for listening, as you always do. Be well.